So, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to the new episode of Unlock Your Potential. And today we have another special guest all the way from Maryland, USA. Are you in Maryland right now, Dr. Faizan, or Canada?
I'm currently in Canada, but I do work in Maryland, so I'm kind of teetering between the two.
No worries. We are all on a Zoom global world platform right now. It doesn't make a difference. Anyhow, just a quick introduction about Dr. Faizan. Dr. Faizan Imtiaz is an assistant professor of organizational psychology at Towson University in Maryland. His research interest includes individual and team resilience, organizational culture, and group dynamics. His teaching portfolio includes work at both the graduate and undergraduate level and across a diverse range of topics, including resilience, leadership, and diversity in workplace. Dr. Imtiaz received his PhD in psychology from Queen's University in Canada, where he's also completed his MSc in sports psychology. And that is where mostly the discussion is going to be today about. So welcome to this program, Dr. Faizan. We really appreciate that you've taken the time to join in. And I understand that you will also be giving us a quick presentation, and then we'll open the floor for question and answers. As usual, we have our regular distinguished panelists, Mr. Neville Gond, all the way from UK, London, and Mr. Kamran Rizvi from Islamabad. But we have live attendees, so feel free to please insert your questions in the chat box. We'll be happy to read them over, or raise your hand during the Q&A, and we'll be happy to open your mic so you can directly have audio conversation with the speaker. So over to you, Dr. Faizan.
All right, thank you for that introduction, and it's great to be here. I'm very much looking forward to our discussion today. And as you mentioned, I will start by sharing a very brief presentation. Don't worry, I know Ali said I'm a professor, but it's not a lecture by any means. I know that's not what you want, but it's just to kind of orient ourselves to the framework that I think would be an interesting discussion for us today. And that is the realm of applied sports psychology. And so I'm going to start, I believe you should be able to now see my slides. If not, then raise your hand or let me know. But
yes,
I'm going to start by, good, okay. So just by giving you a background of how we got here, or how specifically I got here in terms of my interest in organizational psychology. And so I'm going to take you back, and I'm going to actually start with a little quiz for you guys and test you a little bit. But if we go back to 2010 first, Canada had something called Own the Podium when we were hosting the 2010 Winter Olympics. And this was a very large scale initiative aimed at putting Canada on the map in terms of global competition and performance. It ended up being highly successful. I think Canada finished #1 in overall gold medals, and the tally was very good. Canadian athletes outperformed their past performances by a large margin, and this was all good. The quiz question is, when was the last time Canada hosted the Olympics before 2010? Anyone?
1960, just rough guess.
That's so not quite. It was actually 1988 in Calgary. So it was a year after I was born. I don't remember it vividly, but I have heard about it. And so at the time, I bring this up because Canada wasn't the powerhouse in the Olympics as it was in 2010. In fact, the country only won 5 medals total, not gold, but 5 medals. And for a country this size, that was alarming, to say the least, from a sports psychology, from a performance perspective. The really interesting thing is, in 1988 in Calgary, out of those 5 athletes who medaled, 4 of them were working with a sports psychologist named Peter Jensen. Peter Jensen is one of my mentors, and while I was doing my PhD at Queen's University, I was very fortunate to be around him. He presented in one of the executive education programs on leadership. And so if we go back again to 1988, people started asking questions. So you've got this country that's not performing very well, and yet in the country, those who are performing well, the 5 medalists, 4 out of 5 of them are working with this guy doing this sports psychology thing. That's it. That's pretty interesting. 80% of the athletes who are succeeding are doing this. What is this sports psychology thing? Maybe other people should do it. And so to understand sports psychology, we really need to go back to psychology in general, very briefly. And when psychology began, it was very much interested in both sides of the spectrum. Yes, the clinical side, where if there's an underlying issue or disorder, we go in and we remedy it, but also the other side. What if there isn't an issue? What's happening in the mind when things are going exceptionally well? What's the psychological profile of these elite performers? Unfortunately, as many of you know, in recent times, across the globe, so this is Canada, the UK, Pakistan, everywhere, there's been a much higher focus on the clinical side, what's called a deficit reduction approach. Let's identify what's the issue and let's go in and try to mitigate it. And a byproduct of that is the other side, asset building paradigm, where we try to create the psychological profile, has been ignored. And this is really what sports psychology has invigorated, I think. And even right now, Peter Jensen's working with the Canadian men's Olympic team in basketball, and there's something to say about the stigma around the topic of psychology that this field has been able to break down. In the 80s, one of the reasons why a lot of athletes and teams didn't employ sports psychology is because there was very much a stigma around, we don't want to be, someone's crossing out the Canadian, yes, I thought that's what it was. And I don't know if it's the Islamabad or the UK connection. I have a feeling it's the UK connection, but I won't jump to conclusions. So the stigma aspect of it has been huge in terms of, this is not something that's trying to fix something. It's trying to give you a competitive advantage. It's trying to give you the competitive edge. And athletes gravitated towards that. We jump then to business. And from sport to business, now sports psychology has looked at, well, coaches are very much like leaders. You've got a diverse group of people that you've got to get the best of. They might not know each other and they might not get along with each other, right? Business people are very much like athletes. You've got to perform at a certain time, and there's very little room for error, and the competition is very steep. And right now, I think in the discussion, we'll talk about the current times, there's a lot of uncertainty, and there's a lot of things that you can't control. And if you can't manage that, you can't succeed in sport or business. So it's really interesting how these two things align. And, you know, I'm going to finish off this very, very brief introduction because I really want to chat with you guys about these topics with this idea of, you know, when I do this presentation, I usually pause here because I say, at this point, people usually get excited. The ears perk up and it's like, God, sports psychology, wait a minute. So you can take something, you can take your anxieties and not only reduce them, but actually use them to get better and reach new heights and perform like Haley Wickenheiser or Shahid Afridi or Ben Stokes last summer. You know, like, this is exactly what I want. And so sports psychology feels like it's like going sailing. You've got the sun in your face and the wind behind your back and it's a breeze. And I always pause here because I say that's not quite how it works. To me, the reality is sports psychology is a little bit more like whitewater rafting. It's bumpy, it's rocky, it's not fun. You need like paper and pencil to do exercises. It's very much, training your mind is very much like training your body. It's not fun, but it's what's required to perform at a high level. And so I'm actually going to stop sharing for a second here because we can come back to stuff, but that's just what I wanted to premise our discussion with, is this idea of where sports and performance psychology came from and how it got to be this commonplace thing that many businesses and personal people are interested in. Now, before I turn it over to you guys for a discussion, I want someone to come clean. Who crossed out the Canadian colors there? Need some honesty here.
Yeah, somebody was playing with it.
We'll let it go.
With the tooth. Yeah.
We'll let it go.
Yeah, right. I need to understand how to control the audience, features. But what I did, I have immediately taken an action. Never called me, and now you guys can't unmute unless I allow you to unmute yourself. So let me unmute Kamran Bhai and Mr. Nawal. So hopefully.
Thank you, Ali.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I can breathe now. I can breathe now.
Yeah. I can breathe too. I think it was someone trying to be funny, crossing out the Canadian, but you turned it into a real comedy. So congratulations, Faizan. And put that person right out of tune.
So at this point, I'm thinking in terms of the teaser that you gave us. I think it was more of a teaser, and it's inviting information of a kind. What do we learn from sports, and how can we maximize our potential? How can we reduce our anxiety, or indeed use it to go forward with greater confidence and effectiveness? So shed some light on that. I think you need to share a few thoughts before we can give you a hard time.
Yeah, I love that. It's interesting. It often gets lost in the mix, but to me, and in the sports psychology bubble, people really look at sport as a lab for life. And the reason for that is in sport, and we've all seen this, the emotions and the pressures are the exact same as what we experience in real life. But when it ends, you let it go and it doesn't carry with you. And so really, one of the reasons why I think we can learn a lot from Olympians and from elite athletes is because they have to learn to manage those anxieties. Otherwise, they can't survive. And so, I brought up Ben Stokes, and I'm sure Neville will remember this, but I believe it was last summer in the World Cup where he was, if that's not pressure, he was, I think, the last person remaining, and they were down by a large margin, and he just dug in. Like, he literally dug in. And you see that, and you can feel the pressure, your heart's pounding, which it makes you think, how is this person doing this? How is this human being handling so much pressure? And I think it's because from a very early age, a lot of these athletes are thrown into the fire, and they kind of, it's like trial by fire. They learn how to do it. And so then what that means is, if we can study that, if we can replicate, and to your point, Kamran, think about, so what are they thinking in the performance when they make a mistake? What's the response over hundreds of people or thousands of people? What are they doing pre-competition? What's the routine? How are they debriefing their competitions or their anxieties? Because, in business, we debrief everything. We debrief every meeting, we debrief every pitch, but we don't debrief our interactions and our psychological emotions. And maybe we should think about, hey, you know what, that I got a little bit emotional there, and I wasn't able to clearly articulate my thoughts, and maybe I need to correct that. And so I think, it's a great point of sport is really, it's a lab. It's a lab where you can try things, you can make mistakes, and then carry them to real life, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And if I may
perfect
ask you,
sense. Love it. Absolutely love it.
Beautiful. I know Neville and I'm excited because we're hearing the jargons, the words which we are advocating on our platform at YP2G. But I love the way you said deep breathing, your emotions. Any quick tips? How do we let it go? In sports, very beautiful example. Okay, the match is finished. You go back to your wardrobe or room or hotels, but still, how do you let it go?
Yeah, it's interesting. I call it the art of letting go, and I use this 2x2 matrix of really what we're talking about, and I think now we're getting into so how do you train the mind then? Like how do you actually get on the ground? And to me, it's, well, we need to preface this by talking a little bit about neuroscience and cognitive conditioning. And neuroscience is this idea that the brain is made up of neurons and synapses. And essentially, if you tap into the same areas of the brain enough, then those synapses get stronger over time. And if you do it enough, they become automatic. And so in sports psychology, they call this unconscious competence. The idea that at a certain point, you don't have to think about in the competition, okay, that just happened, I need to let it go. You've repped it out so much with debriefs or with in practice settings, simulating pressure, that you just do it automatically. And this is actually, to pause here, this is why you have often elite athletes who play professional sports well beyond their physical primes, right? And so in America, football is huge, American football. It's a very physical, demanding contact sport. Some athletes play until 30s, 40s. Tom Brady right now is 42. And people think, how are they doing this? And the reason they're able to do that is because they compensate for the physical losses with the mental conditioning and being able to kind of get the advantage there. And so how, you know, back to the neuroscience, I think one analogy that was given to me, which really stuck to me, was it's like you got to picture yourself on a ski hill, and you go up there, and the first time you go down, there's a lot of friction. It's tough because it's fresh snow and no one else has gone down. There's no tracks. You go back up, you go down a second time. It's a bit easier because now there's tracks. The third time, fourth time, fifth time, you're just sailing along. That's kind of how neuroscience works. Every time you think a certain way, so let's say you have a really difficult presentation, we work together, we work on letting go. We actually go through the theories and the exercises. The next time you're in that similar situation, you will at least think of that. That makes it slightly easier. The third time, you're now building the habit. And really, this is how it works. It's really no different than physical training. The first time you go to the gym and you do squats or burpees, it hurts. Like you can barely get up the next day, right? You can barely sit down. The second time you go, it's a bit easier. The fifth and sixth time, your body can start to handle it. And so the only trouble, and I'll finish with this because it's a really good question. It's a deep question. The only trouble with mental conditioning is you can't see the changes, right? If I go to the gym and I work out, I feel it the next day. That's what encourages me to go back. No pain, no gain. I feel it, so I go back. With the mind, it's a bit trickier. You've got to trust the process. And unfortunately, when you can't see the changes, people often give up much easier. But the reality is it's happening. It's happening. It's there. And we have the technology and the science now to track muscular change. And I can get into, there's actually studies showing how things like mindfulness, practicing mindfulness for several weeks changes areas of the brain associated with decision-making, with awareness, and all of these good things. So hopefully that makes sense, Ali.
Thanks. Brilliant. Very well explained.
It does. You touched on so many issues there. I think for everyone, we need to unpick a couple. So about this tangible thing. Let's look at Ben Stokes or any other famous sports person that you see in action. And the nice thing is we can see their mental ability in action. And people say, how do you empathize? They often ask that question to what we do. And I say, do you like sport? And they say, yeah, I love sport. Okay. Well, when you're watching your favorite sport and you get really engaged in it, that's called empathy. And people go, oh, now I get it. So it's we like Ben Stokes. You're absolutely right. He was there, literally. Can he hit another six? No, I don't believe he can hit another six. You know, yeah. Is he going to get that last ball? And you just think, from a technical point, you think all the bowler's got to do is bowl it so he can't hit it. That's all he's got to do.
That's it.
But what was in the mentality of the bowler with that last ball to say, I'm going to get him. I'm going to get him. Forget about winning. I'm going to get him. So almost put in personal benefit above the team, which was at that point was unheard of, because there you had a team that really should have gone and won. I mean, England should never have won the World Cup, frankly, from what they did. But I think this... So you mentioned a really interesting one there, but I'd like to pick up on one point about one of the most popular gifts at Christmas is gym membership.
Yes.
And yet by the end of January, most people have stopped up going to the gym.
Yeah. And
is it just purely because they don't see the benefit? Because they're not committed to it, they haven't got grit, or as we would call, they're not mind fit? What is it that, you know, I did burpees the other day, which I haven't done burpees for some considerable time, by the way. And the following morning I got up, my backside was so painful. Yeah. And my wife said, well, you've just got to do it again, haven't you? That's right. And that's the classic no pain, no gain. But let's go back to this gym membership. So what is it? By the end of January, everyone's given up.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. That's a really good question. I just took a couple notes because your comments made me think. Empathy is an interesting point, right? Because what you're talking about with watching Ben Stokes, or I'm trying to think of the Pakistani equivalent. I don't know if we have one right now. God, Kamran, we don't have the. But anyways, with Ben Stokes, so I'm watching, or you're watching, empathy. People, and it's interesting because not many people understand what empathy means, right? People think it's just understanding what the other person's going through, whereas it's really sharing the experience. That's the critical piece for me. It's sharing the emotional experience you're having, and that's what draws people to sport. I feel it. I feel it for my country, and you're doing something special, and I feel your pressure. And so that's interesting because I think in leadership, empathy, because we don't have a good understanding of it, to our discussion prior, because we don't have awareness of what empathy actually is, it's really difficult to implement it. And a lot of leaders think they're empathic, whereas if you ask their employees, not so much. So that's maybe a different discussion for us to have altogether. But the bowler is a good point you bring up, because yes, when we study that experience, we think of, what is it about Ben Stokes? How did he do that incredible performance? And it was incredible, but something happened in the mind of the bowler which derailed that performance. I mean, all he had to do was not give up consecutive sixes. And so you're right. Is it arrogance? Is it just a lack of concentration? And is it both? And so again, going back to the mindfulness, I have a video, which if time permits, I'll show you a bit of it, but I'm not sure if you've come across the movie Free Solo. It's about this guy, Alex Honnold. It's called Free Solo. And essentially, he scales massive mountains with nothing. No rope, no support, nothing. And it's incredible to watch. And when people talk about mindfulness and being in the moment, that's it from a performance perspective. It's the idea that, can you afford to get distracted for 1 second when you're doing that? Right? And you can't, because the consequences are so real, right? And so mindfulness is really, to me, what happens to the quality of your thoughts when things get tight, when you're unsure. And if you can master that, then, I mean, there's incredible implications on performance. And so what happened to the bowler? The bowler clearly wasn't being mindful of the moment. If he was, he would have been able to deliver. And to the last question that you brought up about the gym, see, I'm not sure if it is not being able to see it as much as just motivation. I think it's motivation. I think the reality is, when January hits, it's a new year. When Ramadan hits, it's a new year, and we have all these goals. And at the beginning, they're fresh in your mind. And the reality is, as the year goes, then other goals get added on top of that. And after a while, it comes down to prioritization. And unfortunately, I think it's actually the opposite of what we were discussing. We can't see the illnesses associated with not exercising. That's what I think prevents us from exercising. It's not that because we see the benefits. If I did 10 burpees right now, I don't know if I'd get back up to finish this presentation. I mean, they're hard. And so I would feel that, but I can't visualize, hey, if I don't go for regular walks during this pandemic, I'm not moving potentially the entire day. That's not good for me. And so I can't see the long-term implications of that, which might hurt my motivation. And so I think that's one piece. And then the other one, I think, is, I think that's the main one, prioritization. But the habit piece, I think, is interesting as well. There's something in psychology called implementation intentions. It's a really cool concept, implementation intentions. And what these researchers argue is, you can't wait to have time to exercise or to go to the gym, because we're too busy. Our society's, busyness, and this is actually one of my pet peeves, busyness is actually so woven so deeply into our society that the idea of multitasking and always having something going on and never being free is something that we're like born with in the West, especially. But implementation intentions is, you set up what if plans. And it's something along the lines of, if I get home, if I work, let's say till 5, if I get home before 5 on a weekday, I'm going to go for a 10-minute walk. That's it. And so when you just look for the what in the situation. So if I get home at 4:30, then I go for a quick walk because I'm still done my work by 5. And, or if you accomplish this, then you'll do that. And what they found is that's actually more effective because people don't have to get motivated. They just follow through with the what ifs. So it's interesting. There's novel ways that people are coming up with how to deal with these kind of lack of motivation issues, but you can attack it from a different perspectives. I think at some point today, we'll talk about relationships. I think relationships are critical for motivation and exercise as well.
Yeah, and I know, Kamran, why you have your turn, but Mr. Zafar Usmani has also requested if he can make a comment. Mr. Usmani is the ex-director HR for the largest bank in Pakistan, HBL, and the CEO of Karachi Electric Supply. So, G. Usmani Saab, I've unmuted you, so please, if you have a quick comment that you requested for.
Thank you so much. First, I want to congratulate you, Kamran, and Neville for this continued learning, brilliant exercises, and of course, Faizan for making such a brilliant presentation, very interesting. And you see, I was listening and I saw this example of human brilliance, which come as a freak sometime, and you cannot really give a reason to it. The person is same, the bowler is same, his quality of bowling, the skill level is same, the commitment is same throughout the match and throughout the program, and feeling for the country and everything. But somehow there is this element which you actually cannot explain, right. Which comes as a human, or I would say a superhuman kind of a flair that comes. Is it luck? Is it something, the chemistry that is not explainable? But there are examples like that. Last week, somebody sent me a last over clip of a 50 overs match, where in the last over, in the 6 balls, 5 wickets were taken. And, I think the completely match was, turned around. So I keep wondering, there are days in all the players also. You'll ask them, you'll see the brilliant player. Some days they say are good days. And, they have the footballers and everybody says, amazing. That day you are just, everything is on the flow. But the same person on another day. So is it, I'm just trying to understand that and take a grapple with what you're saying. It's not a predictable thing that a person, okay, you train them emotionally, he's ready, he's strong, but it's not a predictable thing. It just happens some days. And, I don't know how to reconcile the two. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That's a great question. And it's interesting. What the psychologist would say, there's actually a name for what you're describing, these kind of out of the ordinary performances. It's called flow. It's called a flow state. And there's a book on it. It's by a researcher named Csikszentmihalyi. A really difficult name to present. I'll find it and I'll put it in the chat after. But Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi has done a ton of research on this idea of flow. And what flow state is basically time basically gets put into the periphery. And actually, everyone in the room has experienced flow state at some level. It's just that some elite performers experience it more. Essentially, what happens is you lose track of time. You're so focused in the task at hand that time becomes irrelevant. And it's defined by 3 things. Very high levels of enjoyment with very high levels of effort and concentration. And those 3 things in combination are very rare to find. What the research shows is certain domains will give you 2 and miss 1. Some will give you the other 2 will miss 1. For example, in school, what we find is if you do these studies with pagers and you get people's experiences during the school day, high in concentration, high in focus, very low in enjoyment, most of the time, right? If you go to leisure, so just playing, watching TV or playing video games, very high in enjoyment, sometimes high in effort, not very high in concentration, okay? And so what gives you these 3 things? It's interesting. If you look at the averages, it's usually things like voluntary intrinsic activities, such as sport, performance arts, writing, things like this. Things that people will do, they would do for free. Athletes say this all the time. I would play this game for free. They usually don't. They usually play for millions of dollars, but they say they'll play it for free, okay? So they will play for free, but then they're really into it. And what happens is if you get into this state enough, then you get into flow. And if you think about when you've experienced it, I was just thinking, and it's really hard to get into, so I'm not saying we're in the flow state right now, but if I look at my time, it's 8:46. We're more than halfway through our conversation. And to me, it feels like we just started. And so that is usually a good sign that you're having a good conversation, you're having a good presentation, you're having a good performance, because if you're looking at your clock like, 10 minutes gone, 50 more to go, 40 more to go, that's the opposite of flow. So you're right, to your point, you know, these elite performers, the cricketers and the bowlers, they do, it is hard to predict, but here's my question back to you. We still see it in those athletes more times than not. They don't do it every single time because that's impossible, but they do it like once or twice a year, and they do it several times throughout their careers. You have these, you know, these Wasim Akrams. My father's a big cricket guy. I'm with you. I see these old clips all the time. Wasim Akram was quite a bowler. And so he got into this flow state several times in his career. I've seen it. And time goes out the window and you're just, nothing else matters. And again, how do you train that? Through mindfulness, through deliberately practicing being in the moment, turning down the volume on the past or the future, and just repping it out, practicing that over and over and over again until you build this unconscious competence.
Brilliant. I think the concept of flow is brilliant. Brilliant. It's a concept of flow is brilliant. And I think it does to a certain extent give you, but again, you know, just one point, just keep in mind, I don't think we have an answer. There is streak of luck that we say, you know, there's certain days, one is the common thing, you know, Kamran and Neville, we do training and we say someday with all preparation, it's just gone beautiful. I don't even know how it goes. It was beautiful. Some days you find yourself struggling and dragging it around. So I don't know, those are the good and bad days. But this is something that is streak that I don't know where it comes from, but there is something super human about it.
I agree with you. I think there's an element of chance. You know, you can call it divine decree, you can call it chance, whatever you want to call it. I think there is an element of that. And I would just say, it still happens less to the elite performers. That's how they always end up at the end. The Rafael Nadals, the Roger Federers, the Tiger Woods, they're still exposed to the same element of luck or chance or divine decree as everyone else, but they seem to manage it better than others. So I think it's a combination. I think it's a combination of the circumstance you find yourself in, and then how you adjust to it, how you cope with it. And that's really what we're interested in. I'm not interested in what happens necessarily or how you deal with things when the performance is going well. I mean, or when life is going well. I think that's easy. You tell a few jokes, you laugh, and then you go on. It's when you're on the ground. It's when you get knocked down that it matters. And I have, you know, I've been reading more and more into this concept of front loading these days. The idea of front loading. And if I may, I want to show you guys something because it's such a great question. Front loading is the idea that, so I'm talking about resilience, and people think you can learn about resilience and then you can just wait for the stressor to happen and then be resilient. And the reality is, if we wait until we get knocked down to get back up and be resilient, it's too late. Because when you get knocked down, you lose your perspective, you lose your thinking, and you can't reach the same level of thinking and behavior. And so really what we need to do is, we need to prepare for the next stress or anxiety. Now, something like COVID is crazy because no one could have predicted it. But from my conversations with people over the last several weeks, the ones that are coping with it better are the ones that are at least acknowledging that this happened. It was chance, divine decree, whatever it might be. But now we need to deal with it. The more we ruminate over, if only that didn't happen. If only that happened, I would be in a much better situation, the more trouble we get into.
I think Cameron wanted to jump in there. You need to unlock.
I have to unmute you now because you opted to mute yourself. Everybody, let me unmute you. I've taken administrative control.
This is called unlock. You realize this, don't you?
Yeah. There you go. You're breathing again now.
All right. So resilience, crisis, pressure, and I believe that these could be external or it could be internal to us. Now, my question to you would be, what is it from a standpoint of psychology? Because it's how we interpret events. I mean, some people are describing COVID as a wow, and others are saying, oh God, we're done. Now, my question here is resilience and how do we deal with a crisis? And it's often heard that leadership emerges in a crisis. So could you please shed some light on this? Thank you.
Absolutely. I think internal, external is a really important point. One of the critical pieces that we begin with when I'm presenting or doing training resilience is one of the main things we need to learn is to shift the focus from the external to the internal when you can't control the external. And the analogy that I give is, take a can of pop, can of Pepsi, can of Sprite, whatever you want, closed and full. And I apply a little bit of pressure on it. What happens? Unless you're really, really strong, nothing happens. It can withstand that pressure. I open up the can, I empty out all of the contents, and now I apply the same amount of pressure. Now the can collapses on itself. The external pressure is the same. What's changed is the inside, the substance. And so really what we need to do in times of crisis is shift the focus from the external to the internal. And so this is critical right now for COVID because, there was a study at University College London, again, a little plug for the Brits in the audience, but there was a study last year at University College London where they looked at what is the driver of fear? When fear paralyzes people in business or in sport or in life, what is the cause of that? And what they found is the number one cause of fear in human beings is uncertainty. People would rather take, in their results, they found people would rather take a sure loss than a 50-50 chance of potential loss, potential nothing. That doesn't make sense rationally because in the first hand, you've got a 100% chance of the loss. In the second chance, you might get off scot-free, 50-50. But here's the thing. In the first one, it's already been decided for you. You know what's coming. You can prepare for it. In the 50-50 chance, there's uncertainty. Is it going to happen? Am I going to get off? And that actually evokes the fight or flight system. It evokes the stress hormones. And people find that more problematic than actually dealing with the stressor itself. And so what that tells us is, one, uncertainty is inherently problematic and disliked by human beings. Well, right now, the entire world is uncertain. I mean, I'm not sure what's going to happen next week with lockdowns being relieved. When is this pandemic going to be over? Is there going to be a second wave? How is the economy going to be impacted? How is my job going to be impacted? Everything is uncertain. And so unless you can shift the focus from external to internal, you're right, you're done. Now, how do you do that? One of the main tools that we talk about is the locus of control. And there is a plethora of research on this and showing that people who learn to develop an internal locus of control, where you identify and lock in on the things you can control, they do much better than people who have an external locus of control in every aspect of life. Now, how do you do that? You have to train it. You have to rep it out. And so I have an exercise where right now we go through, okay, what are the main 5 challenges in your life as a result of COVID? Write them down. And so take 5 minutes, think about it. The next step 2 is, of these 5, which ones are inside your locus of control? You can change them, you can do something about it. And which ones are external, which means you can think about it as much as you want. You can stress about it as much as you want. It's not going to change the fact. That awareness then leads to step 3. What are the opportunities in the ones that you can control, right? And so I think people in this room have done this exercise mentally because that's what brought us here. Otherwise, it would have been, well, I can't do training anymore. Resilience is done until we get back on site. The opportunity that COVID, although it's been a very negative experience worldwide, the opportunity that COVID has given us is to become efficient at online learning, to learn to deliver content on Zoom. And so that's the opportunity where you don't get to that stage unless you get to the internal locus of control. And you'd be surprised, many people don't get there. We spend so much time thinking about stuff we can't control. Other people, the weather. I live in Canada. We spend half the year worrying about the weather. You know, our bosses, our employees, the economy. And the last thing I'll say about this is, it's not just a stress thing. People think the locus of control is just, oh, you'll feel better. No, no, no. It's an energy thing. The more you think about stuff you can't control, the more you drain the energy that you have inside of you. And what happens is when it comes time to perform, there's nothing left in the tank because energy is finite. The human brain is about 2% of our body weight, and it consumes about 20% of our energy. It's not proportional. And so it's such a critical piece. I would say from my work, if I had to identify one thing, the one differentiator between people who are resilient, they can cope, they can bounce back, and people who can't, it's the locus of control. That's the one. That's the one for me. And I've had people come back months later and say, that changed my life. The other stuff is great, but that changed my life because I was spending so much time and so much energy on stuff I couldn't control and wasting that energy.
Beautiful.
Again, this is so rich. I mean, there's so much here that people can pick into. I want to go back to being in the zone, because you said everyone has been in that zone at some time. I think my comment would be, I don't think people realize how often they've been in the zone, but they certainly know when they're not.
Yes.
Because they do a lot of this. God, is it really? I mean, we've been going for 45 minutes and we haven't started. I'm raring to go here. You know, I haven't even got up to the blocks, and I have a feeling that other people will be in the same place. Well, folks, you've just got in the zone. Okay. So what you need to do, I think what we all need to do, is work out, when you set yourself a target and you say, in the next hour, I'm going to do this because I'm really excited by it. And put the watch on and put the timer on, but turn it the other way so you can't see what's going on, and get after it and see how much you achieve when the timer's gone off. Then immediately say, what happened there? Why was I so excited? Why did time fly so much? So that the reality is that the more in the zone I'm going to be, the shorter life I'm going to have. It is a paradox, isn't it? The more boring the task, the time just tick, 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 stop, tick, tick. And yet any top athlete wants to get into the zone. So it is a bit of a paradox where they want their life to flash by. But the other thing is, we haven't mentioned a word that we use quite a lot of the time here. Zafar sort of touched on it when he said luck. What about beliefs? Where does that fit in this? Where does that fit in Ben Stokes, knowing he's got one shot and that's it? Is it self-belief that really is that underlying driver?
It's a great question. I think, and I think we're getting into the realm of confidence, right? And where does that confidence comes from? And I think, you know, by far the number one source of confidence is past success. It's why the rich get richer. It's why the elite athletes, it takes them, you know, I'm not sure if you guys are ever, you know, Netflix is like soaring these days because we're all locked in, but there's a documentary on Netflix right now about Michael Jordan. You want to talk about elite performers, that might be the elite performer in history. One of them, I think. And one of the things people don't realize is they won 6 consecutive championships. He won 3, left for a couple of years. They came back, won 3 more. And that's the pinnacle of sports success in the West. People don't realize they lost for 6 years before the first one. And so it wasn't until they experienced success and they broke through that they were able to then get on the roll. So there's something about experiencing success which gives you that self-belief. Ben Stokes has been in the zone before. Maybe we haven't seen it. Maybe it was when he was an amateur. Maybe it was when he was on the playground. But because he's been there, that's where that self-belief comes from. You take someone who's never played cricket before, never done a presentation before, never taught a course before in university, and you put them out there, you can't will yourself through that type of performance. There's a reality check there too. But to your point, beliefs, where do they come from? I think there's something to the research by Martin Seligman. Martin Seligman at University of Pennsylvania used to be the president of the APA, the American Psychological Association. And he has a book called Learned Optimism. And it comes from a prior book called Learned Pessimism. And it's all about where do these belief systems come from? And the idea is there's a very distinct difference between how optimists approach and respond to a task and how pessimists do it. And I believe if I'm getting the framework right, you can conceptualize it as the 3 P's of performance. It's pervasiveness, permanence, and then the internal aspect, the personal aspect. So when good things happen to optimists, they look at them as permanent. It's going to keep happening. If I just hit a 6, I'm going to hit a 6 the next time too. They look at it as pervasive. If I'm good at cricket, I'm going to be good at home too. I'm going to have a good personal life. It's called the halo effect. It's why people who do well at school do well in relationships. People who do well in relationships do well at work. Things spill over. And personal. If I do something good, it's because of my hard work. It's because of my family. It's because of my upbringing. You go to the opposite side, the pessimist. If you work with people who are lacking in confidence and you always have to pick them up and they just don't believe in themselves, they have no idea what they can accomplish, they do the exact opposite. If something good happens, they look at it as not permanent, as temporary. Yeah, that happened this time, but it won't happen next time. It was just luck. They look at it as not pervasive. They look at it as isolated. Yeah, I might be good at work, but it doesn't matter at home. It doesn't mean I'm a good person or I'm a good father or whatever it might be. And the last piece, they don't look at it as personal. They look at it as external. Oh, it was just an easy test. Oh, that bowler was just off his game. And this is how they consistently, it's called explanatory styles. How do you explain the experiences that happen to you? And what we know from social psychology is we're not passive observers of life. The human mind is very unruly. And people think you just walk through life. No. Every experience you have throughout the day, your mind thinks, so what does that mean? What does that say about me? What does it say about the world? So what does that say about my place in the world? And this is the narrative. This is the narrative that your mind has all day. And then this goes back to the explanatory styles. How are you explaining the successes? And we didn't even get to the failures. The failures basically flip. The pessimists see the failures as permanent. It'll always be like this. And as because of them and their shortcomings. And the optimists see it the opposite. Oh, that was just luck. I'll do better next time. It was a fluke. I missed it. I can hit that. And so it really does work this way. And I think the combination of these two things, past success and the narrative that you have with yourself, the story that you tell yourself as you go through life, really, I think is what combines to create confidence. At least that's my understanding thus far. Confidence is a very tricky thing.
Yeah, we get asked pretty often, how do you get confidence? And a lot of people have got the answer. It's just they're not prepared to take it on board. So how do you get confident in doing something? We'll go and do it and see what happens. And then next time, try and do it a little better, and then try and do it a little better. And that's where the sports personal best comes into it, because a leader can only feel good about perhaps the KPIs that are getting beat, you know, or having that inner belief and happiness that they know they're going to try something new. Whereas a sports person has always got that personal best to fall back on. You know, Ben Stokes, you know, hitting sixes, etc. It's like somewhat different in cricket. But the other athletes, you know, the long distance runners, the short distance runners, the hurdlers, the high jump, the long jump, there is not only a personal best, but there's the world best.
Yeah.
There's the Olympic best, which you can get the Olympic gold without getting the world best. So I think in the sporting arena, it's always about beating something.
Yeah.
Rather than beating someone else, it's beating something. And that's where I think maybe this externalization issue you talked about.
Yeah.
So it's not personal anymore. It's just personal to you.
Yeah, I see your hand, Cameron. I'm just going to, just Neville, just to add to that, I think, so, you know, taking it outside of sport, I think one of the ways, again, sports as a lab is sometimes it's about lowering the bar and the expectations, right? So a good coach, when he sees an athlete trying to do too much, we'll take him out of that. We'll pull him out and we'll put him in a situation where he actually experiences success and builds the confidence. And then once that's mastered, then you move him up to the A team or the varsity team.
That's really important. Yeah.
And you can do that. So you can do that in business as well, but you have to have awareness and you have to know it. Unfortunately, I think what happens is people maybe at the onset of their careers want to be up here. They want to perform here. And when they try to compete here, when they really should be down here, they get exposed to so much failure that it just completely breaks down their confidence to a point where they can't build it back up. So it's just, that's a very critical point. And again, with the COVID, I think that's one of the big issues right now. I've seen that one of the biggest issues is people fighting perfectionism. High performers are used to performing here, and this pandemic is requiring us to potentially go down here. To be honest, the presentation, we're having a great chat, it's amazing, but this could be better if we were live, because I would have slides, I would have videos, I would be able to pull into data. And so for a lot of people, they won't do this. They won't do Zoom webinars because it's not a 10 out of 10. But right now, maybe an 8 or a 9 out of 10 is better than nothing at all. So that's, I think, very important to managing the current pandemic is we've got to fight perfectionism. Kamran, I saw you had your hand up, so I want to.
Hey, Kamran, wait.
Yes, now, you know, quick wins can systematically build your confidence. Very, very true. Visualization, I feel, is an area which I would like your commentary on, because from what I believe, if you can't see it, you can't do it. And in the mind itself, like when you spoke of narrative and storytelling and what you tell yourself all the time, if I can't imagine something, how the hell can I even pursue it? And it takes courage to visualize a scenario which is as real as though it has happened. So what's the power of visualization in being able to deal with the current situation? For example, in internal locus of control. And for instance, we talk about the future. Will it happen to us or would we invent it? Now, the invention and the happening of it, just shed some light on that too. Please.
Yeah, that's a great point. And Peter Jensen, who I referenced at the beginning, great mentor of mine, who's the sports psychologist for a lot of our Canadian Olympic teams, he says that imagery or visualization is the language of performance. Imagery is the language of performance. And I think that gets to what you're saying. And Albert Einstein said, well, what's the quote? Imagination is your preview of what's coming in life, of what's going to be expected. And so we've known this for a long time. And you're right. You know, we know this even intuitively. If I can't visualize it, then it can't happen. Now, I think where it gets interesting is it goes both ways. The first challenge for people in terms of leveraging visualization is we're often visualizing the wrong thing. People are often visualizing what they don't want to happen. I hope I don't stutter. I hope I don't trip. I hope I don't drop that ball. I think that's what all the Pakistani players do, and they drop the ball more than anyone else, as far as I can tell. It's very upsetting to me, actually. But so visualizing the wrong thing instead of visualizing making it happen. Now, there's another aspect to that, which I'll get to, but in terms of how you use that, Kamran, the elite performers, they visualize down to the second. So if it's, I've got a clip of a bobsledder, Canadian bobsledder, it's 1:30 or something like that. And that's to the T how long roughly the world record is. And he's sitting there in a chair, and you see this, right? And it's all, the more senses are involved, the more realistic it is. And the research is clear on that. It was with skiers, they had them sit down and do vivid visualization, proper with the technique. And what they found is there was actual slight muscular activity in their legs, even though they were just sitting there. And the reason for that is when you visualize something vividly, your mind can't tell if it's happening or if you're just thinking about it. This is why when you're sleeping, you're walking in your dream and you trip, and in your bed, your leg goes and you jerk. Because your mind, when you're sleeping, you're unconscious, but your mind can't differentiate whether something is actually happening or whether it's in your mind. So it's really interesting. But the thing I'll finish with, Kamran, is, and this is where it gets really interesting for me in business, I think visualizing is actually about not repeating the mistakes. And so I often, when I'm working with young people, I know you guys do a lot of work with the Young Leadership Institute. I often ask young people, hey, are mistakes expensive? Do mistakes hurt? And they look around, and then one of them usually says, yeah, it hurts. If I make a mistake in front of people, it hurts. If I make a mistake in front of my parents, it hurts. I said, okay, well, here's what's happening in your mind when you replay that mistake over and over again. It's like going through a toll. You know, you go through a toll, you pay to go in on the highway, and then you drive up for 1 kilometer, and you decide, I'm going to go back, and I'm going to go through the toll again. You pay again, you drive up for a couple kilometers, and you decide, I'm going to come back. No one would do this. You've paid once, it already hurts. Why would you do it again? This is essentially what's happening in the mind when we replay bad performances. And the impact that it has on our bodies is incredible. It's incredible. The cortisol, the adrenaline, the fight or flight response, it cripples people. It's really sad. It cripples people. And even you know, if you get to long-term health, like things like blood pressure and heart disease, partly stem from always being wired, always having this system firing, and it never gets a break. It's always revved up. So I actually focus these days more on imagery on the second spectrum. I'm not sure what your thoughts are on that, but you know, I do believe it's very powerful, but I think it can be equally as destructive. You know what I mean?
Very good. Very good. So I'm just looking at the clock, so we are really pressed on time, but let us take one question from one of our attendees. It's like a common question from Mr. Hassan Raza, that prediction, long-term physical, mental health consequences, fear of entering to next phase of New World Order, COVID-19 has shattered the self-confidence. I know you have briefly touched upon it, but any quick comments on it, Dr. Faizan?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think, I'm just going to pull up the chat because I think there's a couple questions there, but I think the long-term physical, mental consequences are, I think what Kamran and I were just alluding to. It's, if the mind is not right, it spills over into the body. And we've just underestimated the impact of the mind on the body. And I bring this up, I wanted to, the time flew by, but I actually thought we could have an interesting discussion on stigma around psychology and mental health in Pakistan. Because I know it's very strong in our community here in Canada. Toronto has a very large Muslim and Pakistani community, and the stigma is incredible. If someone is experiencing mental health issues, the first thing that happens is we go to the clerics and people think the person's possessed. And I think there's a place for that. I personally, to be honest, I believe those things can happen, but not always. And I've talked to imams and religious leaders, and they harp on the fact that it's much more likely for the person to be experiencing anxiety and depression than for them to be possessed. But people in our community, because there's such a strong stigma, won't go in that direction. So it's a separate conversation. We'll have to have another webinar, I think, for that. But
that's an interesting topic.
The issue of the New World Order. Yeah, I mean, I think I'm with you guys with what you were discussing before. I think this is the new reality. I think we're gonna go back to a hybrid world where some things will be face to face and many things will be online, and people who can leverage both of these things will survive. So how do you do that? I think front loading, preparing for the next stressor to come, which is how do you take your business partly online? How do you keep it online? And just being ready for the fact that it's going to be rocky, right? I did a presentation for MBA students, and I started and I told them, I'm not here to tell you everything's going to be okay and don't worry. Like, that's not what I'm here for. I'm an optimist. I do think things will be okay, but I think it's going to take some time, and I think it's going to be a rocky road to get there. So there's something in psychology called acceptance-based therapy. And the premise is, until we accept the fact that things are not ideal, there's no way forward. There's a saying, it's what's in the way is the way, right? What's in the way is the way. Sometimes you just can't go around the issue. You can't just wait for it to be over. I think we're finding this out now, right? Some people, when this began, and I heard this a lot. Give it a couple weeks. I don't think we're talking a couple weeks. And so accept that, bring it in front of you, and voluntarily take it on. A book that I would recommend to everyone, and this may be a good place to end, is a book by a psychiatrist, Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning. And Search for Meaning. And it's actually, it's one of the central premises in my work, voluntarily taking on the burden, right? Instead of waiting for it to be thrown on you, voluntarily taking it on, breaking it down, and taking on the challenge. And what happens when you do that is your body doesn't respond with the fight or flight. The body interprets that as challenge instead of threat. It's really interesting. And that obviously helps performance because you stay calm and collected. So that would be my advice, quick advice. I think we're gonna have to have a third webinar because we didn't even talk about relationship. And I think I was working on a model. I called it the 4 R's of resilience. Reframing, relaxation, responding, and there was another one that I was working in there. But I had to add in the 5th one, which is relationships, because there's too much literature on how relationships impact our well-being and our performance. There's too much to ignore now. And so we'll have to save that, I think, for the trilogy. That's great.
I would be very intrigued to moderate a webinar on the topic of clergy versus psychiatrists,
We might need Martin Seligman for that, Ali.
Well, I have to wear a bulletproof to do that, so I guess. But no, that really brings us towards the end of the show. So I really want to thank you, Dr. Faizan, for taking the time. And I must say that we were actually going into that flow that you were talking about, and actually the time passed away. I mean, like, it's already 6:15. So, but that was wonderful, a very, very intriguing talk. I'm very happy that the audience participated in this also. We had Mr. Somani also, who just turned on this video, and Mr. Kamran Rizvi and Neville for joining as usual. So thank you very much once again, everybody who joined in, and we will be, inshallah, inviting Dr. Faizan once again, in fact, a couple of times, as he seems to be excited to deliver a couple of topics with us on this platform. So with that note, I would like to end and conclude. So you all have a good day, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you have joined in from. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Faizan.
Thank you.